Good evening. I'm Claudia Rankin, and I have the honor of presenting the Wallace Stevens Awards. I have something written, but before I read that, I wanted to begin by telling a story. 30 years ago, I was at Williams College, and the work of a poet arrived in my syllabus that I read, and it was the most amazing work. And it belonged to Robert Haas. So imagine I graduate from college, I'm kind of, drifting around, and I decide what I want to do with my life is become a poet. So what does one do? I'm in New York City. I buy a ticket. I go to San Francisco. I go to Berkeley. I find out his office hours. I go to his office and I say, I want to study with you. And he says, but you don't go to this college, you're not a student. My technicalities. So he said, well, if you can figure out a way to make yourself a student, of course you can come study with me. So I went to the admissions office. They said, well, let's see, you could become a non-matriculating student. And so I did. And that semester, I took a workshop and a history of American poetry class. And then I went on my way. I came back to New York and I went to Columbia. Robert Haas's poems and essays are roadmaps. They provide a way for writers, educators, and activists. He models how to be the best human. Anne Wollman wrote in her citation, Robert Haas is one of our most humanitarian poets. Jane Hirschfield wrote in her citation, Robert Haas enlarged the map of American poetry. Claudia Rankin says, Robert Haas has spent his entire career to date showing poets how to enter into the process of creating a better world. Join me in honoring our Wallace Stevens Award recipient.
Boy, it was Claudia a scary person to suddenly find in your class. He was so formidably smart and quite willing to let you know if she thought what you said was stupid, too, which was... Brian mentioned a dream. I have a novelist friend who had a dream, described to me a dream in which he died and went to heaven, and as soon as he entered, sitting at a kitchen table playing cards were Dostoevsky, Van Gogh, Saul Bellow, and Baudelaire. And Saul Bellow looked up at him and said, you spent way too much time watching sports on TV. In the other heaven, writers you love and have been reading for years sit around a table and decide to give you a prize. I'm so grateful and honored for this prize from the chancellors, and I'm really happy to be in the company of Hannah. So exciting, your first book coming out, and Rigoberto and Luigi and Tracy. It's thrilling. So I'm going to read one poem, and it's called An Argument About Poetics, imagined at Squaw Valley after a night walk under the mountain. My friend Czesław Miłosz disapproved of surrealism. Not hard to construct in imagination the reasons why. It's late night and late winter in Warsaw. Two friends are stopped by the police of the general government, German soldiers who speak atrocious Polish. Because of their leather jackets, where would two young Poles get new brown leather jackets in the winter of 1943? Either they were black marketeers, the police reasoned, or special enough to be left alone. The older cop, who had been a policeman in Berlin in the quiet precincts of Charlottenburg, where he'd learned to go along and get along, and wanted only to do his job well enough to avoid being sent to the Russian front, where he'd either get blown up or lose his toes to frostbite, wants nothing of this arrest. He's the one who lets the poet slip away. The other, younger policeman, a machinist in Cologne before the war, is more ambitious. He asks the second man what he does, which for the young Pole is a quandary. Does he say he's a philosopher, which he thinks of as his profession, or a teamster, which is how he makes his living now to avoid collaborating with the Germans? And secondly, should he answer in Polish or in his serviceable German he's completing after work in his drafty garret room a treatise on the Apollonian and Dionysiac personalities described by Friedrich Nietzsche from a partly Marxist, partly Kabbalistic perspective? He feels instinctively that the danger lay in claiming a superior social status, and so he says in Polish that he's a teamster, and the cop thinks, aha, black market, and takes him in. He's interrogated, turned over to the SS, beaten, interrogated some more, identified as a communist and an intellectual, possibly a Jew, and sent east to Auschwitz, where he eventually dies, shot, some of the stories say wasted by typhus and diarrhea, say the others. The poet hears one of the versions of this news on a same spring day that he's contemplating a large, polished porcelain giraffe bobbing up and down to the strains of the Vienna Waltz on a holiday carousel while gunfire crackles on the other side of the ghetto wall. Warsaw had been a Russian garrison town for a century. Now it's a German garrison town. And the pretty Polish girl on the giraffe is licking a pink cloud of cotton candy and flirting with the German officer on the zebra, which is also bobbing up and down, and the sheen on his high black boots, the poet notices involuntarily, has picked up the reflection of the sun in the small pools of spring rain in the warped tarmac apron of the carousel. After that, he doesn't want to read about French poets walking lobsters on a leash. And he doesn't want to seem to celebrate the fact that the world makes no sense. This is how, anyway, I imagine the state of mind produced by the fragment of the stories he would tell me. And here, narrative gives way to argument. I would quote to him André Breton in the English translation by way of refutation. My wife with the armpits of Nettletrap and St. John's Eve. And he would say, or anyway now in my imagination, he would say, well, yes, of course, I assent to armpits and metaphors at which Breton excelled, just as Modigliani excelled at armpits. Who does not love metaphor, its quickness that gives us the world to taste with our common senses? I will tell you what terrifies me. It is the idea that this is like that, is like this, is like that, could be all of the story, endlessly repeated. The poor human imagination having evolved this brilliant swiftness of perception and then being stuck there, like a hamster in a cage, groping in the endless turnstiles of resemblance. We are to celebrate this as a final conquest of absurdity by absurdity. The armpits of those women in Modigliani, I'm imagining him saying it's night under the mountain. On the contrary, our particular armpits, like this perhaps, or like that, but finally, this woman exposing to us this tender nest or dark sweetness of a wet duck's feather tuft of hair in a gesture, notice, that lifts the breast slightly, indolently, and lifts the rosy nipple and offers it to us, one of the gifts. Also sunrise, the scent of linen, of the air before first snow, that the world has to give poor mortals among the terrors and confusions of being who we are. Well, I might have said, prissily, if you want to get technical, Modigliani is making a generalized representation of the idea of a particular woman, and he exactly a particular woman. General because this and not that, this not like that, this one mortal thing is what mortality has given us in common. It's general. And that's the Miłosz religion? Yes, he laughs. In my religion, if we're going to starve to death, we will starve on the pears of Cézanne and the apples of Chardin. In my religion, metaphor makes us ache because things are and are what they are and perish. And let us not neglect to consider the slow withering of the pale skin of that girl and her nest of lymph nodes and the pheromones of love and fear. And we mustn't fail to mention lymphatic cancers, nature's brutally stupid way of clearing the earth of organisms for organisms freed temporarily from withering and disease, and the misfiring of the avidity to reproduce of cells we are made of in some chemical slime. Or, on the subject of armpits, the smell of fear. Which reminds us that in Mr. Darwin's scheme, we are to find beautiful the fact that among the higher mammals, the sauce that gives spice to their meat is the adrenaline of pure fear. Or, for all we know, despair in the prey they are devouring. Nature is, after all, chemistry, and chemistry is this becomes that, becomes this, becomes that, endlessly through endless witherings, endless contortions of mammal and reptile and insect suffering and fear. What does it know of this armpit, that breast, those lips turned a mirror for glistening and reddening, and the way she, a girl who did not feel pretty as a girl, perhaps examines her plucked, arched, perfectly elegant eyebrows, and pats lightly the slick set of her hair, a 1910 set, that decade's no other, of her thick auburn hair. Something in his voice makes me say, do you know who she was? Well, there were two women. Jeanne Hébuterne, who killed herself, threw herself out the window. She was pregnant with his child the year after Modigliani died. She was French. Our odalisque of the raised arms was Lunia Tchaikovsky. Modigliani's dealer, Zabrowski, was a poet, a minor one, and was a friend of my uncle, but he died the year I arrived in Paris that first time, so I never met him, though I did meet Tchaikovsky. You met Tchaikovsky? She had me to tea. I was 21. She must have been about 40, thick in the waist, and looked it. It was winter, and she wore tweed. She tested me by conducting our interviews, mostly about my uncle's poetry and Zaborowski's, entirely in French. I remember thinking that her hands looked old, early arthritis perhaps, and were somehow beautiful nevertheless, something precise in the way she served the little Noel cakes and the tea. The cakes which I devoured. I was living on my student stipend and then felt humiliated that I'd cleared the plate before she touched it. He laughed. And I remember her scent, amaryllis. The apartment near the bookstore on Rue Dupuytren smelled of the ginger in the cakes and black tea and her scent of amaryllis like dry summer grass. Czesław was buried in a crypt in the Krakowian church of St. Peter of the Rock, among other Polish notables. I hated the idea of it, and still do, that his particular body is lying there in a cellar of cold marble and old bones under the weight of 2,000 years of the Catholic Church. Thinking about this still years later, imagining this conversation in the California mountain dark under the shadowy mass of the mountain itself and the glittering stars, not liking the fact that it is perhaps what he would have wanted. You should have been buried. I'm still talking to him. You should have been buried on a grassy hillside open to the sun, the Lithuanian sun that peasants carved on crosses in the churchyard of your childhood. And what you called in one poem, the frail light of birches. You should have been buried under the frail light of birches. And he might have said no. He might have said, I choose marble in the Catholic Church because they say no to natural beauty, which lures us and kills us. I say no until poor Modigliani and Zaborowski and Tchaikovsky, the girl of the raised arms and breast, and the grown woman with her ginger cakes and already liver-spotted hands, and Jeanne Hébuterne and her unborn child have risen from the dead. And I say, there's another way of thinking about this. You described headlights sweeping a field on a summer night. You remember, I learned this from you. I can quote to you the lines. You said you could sense the heartbeat of the living and the dead. Yeah, he says. It was a night in July in Pennsylvania, which was to me then an almost inconceivably romantic name. And the air was humid and smelled of wet earth after rain. I remember the night very well. My lines, not so much. Thank you very much. And again, thanks.